Welcome to the RAMP webinar series. We're talking about Component 6, Advisory Council. Please note that each section of the RAMP application has a different point value. This one is worth 5 points. I'm Mark Carans.
And I'm Karen Griffith.
We'd like to ask you to make sure when you're applying for RAMP, you always check the website to ensure that you're using the most current RAMP rubric. It is tweaked now and again, and so you want to make sure you always have the latest version. And please note that it is not changed drastically, and it's usually on a yearly basis, but please always check to make sure you're using the latest version. And it doesn't impact these webinars because what we're talking about some big pieces of this component, and the RAMP rubric is going to be tweaked in smaller ways. But again, that RAMP rubric really guides the application. It clearly tells you what you need to address, what templates you need to use, what needs to be uploaded. It's very clear in that respect.
And one of the things that you'll see us do as you go through this is that we take the rubric and we break it into bulleted lists that can become checklists. You can use that procedure, whatever the rubric says. So we're looking at the Advisory Council. This is number 6. This is the group of people who guide the counseling program, support the counseling program. You can read more about it in the Ask a National Model on page 47 or in the Ask a National Model Implementation Guide on page 89. The Advisory Council is a group of important stakeholders who review and advise the counselors and their counseling program. It must meet a minimum of 2 times each year, one in the fall, one in the spring as usual practice. You have to keep up with your agendas and the minutes for each of those meetings. And in particular, you want this group to provide some feedback on your program goals, usually happens in that fall meeting, and on your program results, which usually happens in your spring meeting. And you want that to be clearly reflected in your minutes and your agendas, that those pieces were a part of the discussion. And then allow for recommendations to come from the Advisory Council. And then these folks can become your strongest advocates, because they're going to be a group of people who truly understand what the counselors do and what the program means to the students in the building.
So I think this is a really good example of how critical the rubric is. If you submit one agenda and 1 minutes from one meeting, you are going to not do well in the scoring process, and because it clearly tells you have to do one in the fall and one in the spring. If you look at the rubric for Advisory Council, it tells you just what Karen said. You want to list the members of the Advisory Council and tell us in the application who they are. So if you put down Mrs. Smith, we need to know that she's a parent, or she's a community member who represents a United Way agency. She's a college admissions counselor from the local university. Again, you have to have an agenda from at least 2 meetings, one in the fall and one in the spring, and then the same thing with minutes. So on the fall agenda, it has to clearly list that you talked and shared your program goals. And then in the spring agenda, we need to see an agenda item that clearly communicates that you talked about the results of your program goals. So it should say program goals, results shared. In the fall, it'd say program goals, updated, shared with stakeholders. I think that the minutes are intended to capture the conversation and the discussion you have with the stakeholders, and you want to be able to communicate how you get that info, you capture that conversation, and then how do you respond to it? Are there some action items that come out of the meeting? And if so, that's a really excellent thing to share.
So again, you're going to provide a list of members and their positions, and you're going to have it a minimum of 2 advisory council meetings with agendas and minutes for each one of those. There's a list of do's and don'ts that's available in the implementation guide. It's a full list on page 92, and these are just some pieces out of that that we thought were particularly important. On the do list, you want to make sure that the membership of your council is representative of your building. You want to have parents from across the grade levels. You want to have all of the subgroups of your building represented. You want to include community, administrators, parents, teachers, students when it's appropriate, but that's a call that you get to make. Students are not required, and I've seen some very creative ways in which students are involved without actually serving on the council, but it's something that you make a decision about in your own professional opinion. You have to meet at least twice, present that data, present the goals, keep your minutes, save your agendas, take detailed notes. Readers of applications want to get a good sense of what happened in the meeting, and the minutes can do that. Provide some good supporting documentation. A lot of people submit any handouts that they distribute during the meeting or the PowerPoints that were used. Those are always helpful for helping the readers understand what happened. For don'ts, don't leave anybody out. Make sure that you've got everybody who needs to have a voice in that meeting. It's not always helpful to have just the people who already think you're wonderful. You might want to include a couple of folks who will offer some different opinions and maybe even some gentle challenges. You want it to be a respectful meeting, but you want it to have some meaning and significance to it. Check the diversity. That matters. Don't create this just for the purposes of RAMP. And don't let it be a subset of another committee. This must be a standalone, and it must be a count that actually functions in an advisory capacity for the school counseling program. Don't forget that data, don't forget your goals, and don't ignore the feedback. Talk about how you use the feedback to better your program.
So in the narrative for advisory council, you can see it tells you, that you want to address 3 points. So like Karen said earlier, we've taken the narrative and we've broken it down into 3 bullet points. And you would write a paragraph. We would encourage you to write a paragraph on each of those. So the first paragraph is going to be the advisory council was developed, and you're going to explain how that was. The members were selected in the following ways. And then the third paragraph is going to talk about how the advisory council guides the program. When there's feedback, what kind of action items are generated from that feedback. So you can share other things, you can upload artifacts, but you must, in the narrative, address these 3 bullet points. And the clearer you are in terms of communicating with the reviewer that you have a paragraph that addresses each, just the easier it is to score and provide feedback on your RAMP application.
So the common pitfalls for advisory council is having a meeting that is not solely focused on the counseling program, letting it be a subset of other existing committees. It needs to be standalone. Not including data and or goals explicitly in the presentations or in the agendas or in the minutes. If the more explicit you are, the less likely you are to lose points on that area. And the third is that the feedback is either not present or not included or so generic that it lacks meaning. So give that feedback very explicit, keep good notes, and talk about how you use their feedback to do what you're doing in an even better way. That's everything about advisory councils. We thank you for joining us and hope that this has been helpful for you in this component of your RAMP application.
And good luck.